We do think the World Cup is going to be a real lift to our industry. We'll have in our markets alone, we'll host about 40 of the matches. There's 6 or 7 markets that we think will see a really big lift from the games. I think that will be a driver.
What's the biggest shift you're seeing in leisure versus business travel for Summit hotels?
Sure. Well, if I rewind to kind of all the way back coming out of the pandemic, what we saw was this huge inflection positively in leisure travel, and a really slow recovery in business transient travel. And we've started to see some of that shift. I think in 2025, we felt a little pressure on the leisure side from a rate perspective in the industry outside of anything maybe other than luxury. I continue to describe business transient grinding higher. And so we haven't seen the same kind of inflection point, but we have seen it continue to grow year over year. And I think when I look at our urban markets and I look at our performance and our occupancies midweek, generally we're full. And so I think we continue to be encouraged that we'll continue to see this ongoing recovery in business transient travel. I do think the leisure dynamics set up for a much better 2026 than what we saw in 2025. Some of that's going to be driven by the World Cup. Some of it should be driven by better dynamics from international inbound travel, which has really lagged over the course of the last couple of years. And I think our expectation, certainly our hope, is that we'll see better performance from that sector going forward.
And what do you see as the strongest driver of RevPAR growth in 2026?
Yeah, well, as I alluded to, we do think the World Cup is going to be a real lift to our industry. We'll have in our markets alone, we'll host about 40 of the matches. There's 6 or 7 markets that we think will see a really big lift from the games. I think that will be a driver. What we saw in 2025 was a big pullback in government demand, and again, a reasonably large pullback in international inbound travel. I think both of those segments of demand will stabilize. We're optimistic we'll see some recovery. And again, I think some of that recovery specifically related to international travel will benefit from the World Cup next year. And some of the other special events, USA 250, should be a big deal in certain markets as well.
And how is Summit thinking about portfolio evolution in a shifting demand landscape?
Yeah, look, we'll always be buyers and sellers of assets. I think we've always felt like that's an important part of the thesis, of the investment thesis of Summit. The company went public with 65 assets back in 2011. We have 95 today, and only 4 of them are from the IPO portfolio. So we've turned over almost the entire portfolio. We'll continue to be very thoughtful around how we evolve our portfolio. Some of that's been driven recently by needing to manage CapEx in a very thoughtful way. And so, what we found is an ability to sell some of our smaller, lower RevPAR, lower margin assets to local owner operators. And we're able to do that at pricing that screens, fairly attractive, particularly relative to where the stock trades at, and gives us an opportunity to pay down debt or reinvest that capital into markets and assets that we think have a better kind of risk-adjusted return profile.
And what's one major shift you expect in hotel demand or traveler behavior in 2026 that will most influence Summit's strategy?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure any one demand trend is going to affect our long-term strategy. I do think there will be a specific revenue management strategy around some of these special events that should be big drivers. And so, as I alluded to, we're in Dallas. Dallas is going to be a host of the World Cup. In fact, the media headquarters will be at the convention center in downtown Dallas. So we'll be really thoughtful around how we revenue strategy and revenue manage around some of these special events next year. Again, I think longer term, we just try to be thoughtful around how our guest preference is evolving and how do we want to allocate capital around those trends.